A nurse paid for a patient's taxi home one snowy evening, just a simple act of kindness. But the next morning at the hospital, she found a mysterious gift waiting for her. What was inside changed her life forever. Stay tuned to uncover the heartwarming twist that will leave you inspired. And before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're watching this from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. The emergency room at Asheville General buzzed with the relentless chaos of a snowy winter evening. Nurses darted between patients, doctors barked orders, and monitors beeped in steady, rhythmic reminders of lives clinging to stability. Amid the whirlwind, Coralie Montgomery stood as a pillar of calm. Her steady hands adjusted an IV line for a child, her voice soothed an anxious mother, and her presence brought a sense of order to the disorder. Yet beneath her professional facade, a quiet storm brewed. As Coralie rounded a corner to grab a moment's reprieve, she noticed a folded envelope slipped under the door of her locker. Tearing it open, her heart sank at the bold, impersonal print. Notice of eviction. She leaned against the cold metal, clutching the letter as the weight of her precarious life outside the hospital settled over her. Bills unpaid, rent overdue. Before the sting of reality could fully settle, the sound of an elderly man coughing violently drew her back into the ER. Walter Hughes. His frail figure hunched over on a gurney, his hands trembling against the white sheet. A nurse passed by with his discharge papers, but his concerned eyes scanned the room. Coralie approached, her voice gentle. "Mr. Hughes, are you all right?" Walter gave a weak smile. "I'm fine, dear, just waiting for my ride. Though I don't reckon anyone's coming tonight." The air between them grew heavy as the truth emerged. Walter had no one to call. His son lived states away, and his nearest relative couldn't drive in the storm. Coralie's chest tightened. A patient without a safe way home, it wasn't just unethical, it was dangerous. Miles, the hospital administrator, strode in briskly, his polished shoes tapping against the tiles. "What's the holdup here, Montgomery?" "Mr. Hughes doesn't have transportation, sir," Coralie replied, her tone measured. "He needs—" Miles cut her off with a dismissive wave. "He's been discharged. What happens after isn't our problem. We don't pay for cabs." Coralie's stomach churned as she watched Miles walk away, his indifference hanging in the air like the chill outside. "Not our problem." Those words echoed in her mind, louder with every passing second. Walter coughed again, and Coralie knelt by his side. "Let me make a call," she said, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. But her fingers didn't dial anyone else. Instead, she reached into her own bag for her wallet, the leather worn from years of use. Every dollar spent on Walter's taxi would mean less for herself, but leaving him stranded wasn't an option. As she helped Walter into the taxi minutes later, her breath fogged in the freezing air. "You take care, Mr. Hughes," she said, her words carrying more weight than either of them realized. "Bless you, dear," Walter said softly, gripping her hand. "You'll be all right. You'll see." Coralie watched the taxi fade into the snowy night, the warmth of his gratitude lingering even as the icy wind bit at her cheeks. Her actions tonight had been guided by her heart, but the consequences awaited in the fluorescent-lit halls of Asheville General. She walked back inside, her breath still visible in the chilled air. Miles stood at the desk, his arms crossed, his eyes cold and calculating. "What you did just now," he started, his tone laced with disapproval. Coralie met his gaze, her voice unwavering. "Someone had to help him. I couldn't just walk away." Miles's expression hardened, and his silence spoke volumes. Coralie knew she had crossed an invisible line, and that she'd face the repercussions soon enough. Coralie stood at the edge of the curb, snowflakes clinging to her hair as the taillights of Walter's taxi disappeared into the stormy night. A deep sense of unease settled over her. Had she done the right thing? The echo of Miles's cutting words still lingered in her ears. "Not our problem." The snow crunched beneath her boots as she turned back toward the hospital entrance, her breath fogging in the frigid air. Behind the glass doors, fluorescent lights reflected the buzz of the ER, but Coralie paused. Her mind traveled back to a memory long buried yet painfully vivid. It was the summer she turned 8. Her family had been evicted from their home, a heartbreaking scene of cardboard boxes and hastily packed belongings. Her mother, worn and tired, tried to keep her voice steady as she told Coralie they'd figure things out. They ended up at a diner on the edge of town, counting loose change to buy a single plate of food to share. A man at the counter, a stranger with kind eyes and a weathered jacket, had quietly paid their bill without a word. Coralie remembered her mother's tears, the stranger's smile, and the note he left behind. Kindness is never wasted. That small act of compassion had been a turning point, giving her family the strength to move forward. The sound of doors sliding open jolted her back to the present. She pushed through the entrance, trying to shake the memory, but its weight followed her. Miles was waiting near the nurses' station, his arms crossed tightly across his chest. "Montgomery," he said sharply. She met his gaze, bracing herself. "Yes, sir." Miles's expression hardened. "I hope you understand the position you've put this hospital in. We cannot afford to have staff making unauthorized decisions, especially ones that could open us up to liability." "Liability?" Coralie's voice rose despite her effort to stay calm. "I paid for a taxi to get an elderly man home safely. That's not liability. That's basic decency." Miles stepped closer, lowering his voice to a steely whisper. "It's not your place to decide what this hospital can or can't afford. Follow the protocol next time, or you'll regret it." Coralie felt her stomach twist, but she refused to look away. "Understood," she said, her tone cold enough to mask the fire beneath. As Miles turned on his heel and walked away, Everett approached, a clipboard in hand and concern etched on his face. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, glancing in the direction Miles had gone. Coralie sighed. "I will be. He's just... Miles." Everett smirked lightly, but the worry in his eyes didn't fade. "You're playing a dangerous game. He's been known to make examples of people who defy him." "I didn't defy him," Coralie replied, her voice firm. "I helped someone who needed it. Isn't that why we're here?" Everett hesitated before nodding. "Just watch your back, all right? This place has its politics, and Miles plays them well." Coralie gave him a faint smile, but his words lingered. Was she jeopardizing her career by staying true to her principles? She tried to shake the doubt as she headed to her locker. When she opened it, a folded piece of paper slipped out and landed at her feet. Picking it up, she recognized the shaky handwriting immediately. It was from Walter. "Thank you for your kindness. People like you keep hope alive in this world. Trust me, your compassion will not go unnoticed." Coralie clutched the note, her throat tightening. Somehow Walter had managed to leave this behind before departing. It was a small gesture, but it carried a profound weight, reassuring her that her actions had mattered to someone. As she tucked the note into her pocket, she noticed something on the corner of the bench next to her locker. A small pin, tarnished with age, but unmistakably shaped like a bridge. She picked it up, its cold surface resting in her palm. Walter must have dropped it. Her gaze lingered on the pin, an odd sense of significance settling over her. Why did it feel so important? The bridge-shaped pin felt cool and unfamiliar in Coralie's palm as she sat in the staff lounge during a rare moment of quiet. The cryptic words from Walter's note replayed in her mind. "Your compassion will not go unnoticed." Her instincts told her there was more to the man than met the eye. Everett entered the room, his usual casual demeanor tempered by concern. "You've been quiet all day," he observed, sitting down across from her. "What's on your mind?" Coralie hesitated, then handed him the note. "Walter left this for me," she said softly, "and I found this pin among his things. Something about it feels important." Everett read the note, his brow furrowing. "Walter Hughes? That's the elderly patient you helped?" Coralie nodded. "I can't shake the feeling there's something I'm missing. Who leaves a note like that, and a pin shaped like a bridge?" Everett tilted his head, thinking. "There's only one way to find out. Ask the people who knew him." Later that afternoon, Coralie sought out Mrs. Delgado, a social worker who often coordinated with the hospital. Mrs. Delgado smiled warmly as Coralie approached her small office tucked into a quiet corner of the hospital. "Walter Hughes," Mrs. Delgado said, adjusting her glasses. "Oh, he was a kind soul. Lived alone in a modest apartment. Quiet, unassuming, but he had a big heart." "Big heart?" Coralie asked, leaning forward. Mrs. Delgado nodded. "Walter spent years supporting underserved communities in Asheville. He'd donate to food drives, fund school programs, even help families pay their utility bills when they were struggling. He never wanted credit, just did it because he cared." Coralie's chest tightened. Walter wasn't just a patient, he was a lifeline for so many people. "Why didn't anyone know about this?" she asked. "Because Walter never made a fuss about it," Mrs. Delgado replied. "He believed kindness didn't need applause." The revelation stayed with Coralie as she walked back to the ER, the hum of fluorescent lights above her head echoing her thoughts. Walter had lived by the very principles she strived to uphold, even in the face of obstacles like Miles. Everett caught up with her at the nurse's station. "I did some digging," he said, holding up a stack of papers. "Turns out Walter was a bigger deal than we thought. He quietly funded local healthcare initiatives, including a significant donation to this hospital about 10 years ago. That money helped keep us afloat during a rough patch." Coralie's eyes widened. "You're kidding." "I'm not," Everett said. "And get this, his donation was anonymous. The only reason I found out is because I cross-referenced some files from the archives. If Walter hadn't stepped up, this place might have shut down." The weight of the information settled over Coralie like a heavy blanket. Walter had done so much for the community, and yet Miles had dismissed him like an inconvenience. Fuming, Coralie marched toward Miles's office, her determination outweighing her trepidation. She found him typing furiously at his desk, the harsh glow of his computer screen reflecting off his glasses. "What do you want, Montgomery?" he asked, barely looking up. "I want to talk about Walter Hughes," Coralie said, standing her ground. Miles sighed, finally meeting her gaze. "This again? I thought we were done with that conversation." "We're not," Coralie said firmly. "Did you know he was one of the hospital's largest benefactors, that he helped save this place when no one else would?" Miles leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I'm aware," he said flatly. "You're aware?" Coralie's voice rose, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Then how could you treat him the way you did? He deserved better." Miles shrugged. "Whatever he did in the past doesn't change the fact that our resources are limited. Sentimentality doesn't pay the bills, Montgomery." Coralie stared at him, a mix of disbelief and anger coursing through her veins. "It's not sentimentality, it's respect, and you're proving once again that you don't care about the people who make this place what it is." Before Miles could respond, Coralie turned on her heel and stormed out, her heart pounding. She didn't regret standing up to him, but she knew the confrontation would only deepen the divide between them. That evening, as Coralie packed up her things to leave, a courier approached her at the front desk. "Coralie Montgomery?" he asked. "Yes," she replied, puzzled. The courier handed her an envelope, thick and slightly weathered. Inside was a single piece of paper, the handwriting familiar but more deliberate this time. "Meet me at the community center on Pine Street tomorrow at 3 p.m. There's more to discuss." The note was postmarked from Walter's estate. Coralie's pulse quickened as she read it again, the bridge-shaped pin still tucked safely in her pocket. What could Walter's estate want with her? The community center on Pine Street stood humbly against the snowy backdrop, its modest brick exterior glowing under the soft lights strung along its awning. Coralie hesitated at the entrance, gripping the bridge-shaped pin in her pocket. The note from Walter's estate had brought her here, but she wasn't sure what to expect. Taking a deep breath, she stepped inside. The warmth of the room greeted her immediately, along with the gentle hum of conversation. Tables were lined with homemade baked goods, children's drawings adorned the walls, and a sense of connection permeated the space. At the center of it all was a bulletin board covered in photographs, letters, and articles, all detailing Walter Hughes's quiet but profound impact on the lives of countless people. A woman in her 60s approached Coralie with a welcoming smile. "You must be Coralie Montgomery," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Lydia, the center's coordinator. We've been expecting you." "Expecting me?" Coralie asked, her brow furrowing. Lydia nodded. "Walter spoke highly of you in his last days. He believed you'd be the one to carry his work forward." Before Coralie could respond, Lydia gestured toward a small circle of people seated nearby. "Come meet some of the lives Walter changed." Coralie joined the group, her apprehension giving way to curiosity. One by one, community members shared their stories. A young mother, her toddler balanced on her hip, recounted how Walter had anonymously covered her medical bills when her son was born prematurely. An elderly man with a cane explained how Walter had helped him regain his independence by funding physical therapy after an accident. A local teacher described Walter's contributions to their underfunded school, ensuring students had supplies and access to meals. Each story added another layer to Walter's legacy, painting a picture of a man who had quietly dedicated his life to lifting others up. Coralie felt a mixture of awe and doubt swelling within her. Could she ever live up to this? "I didn't realize how much he did," Coralie admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did he find the time, or the means, to do all of this?" Lydia's expression softened. Walter was resourceful, but he always said it wasn't about how much you had. It was about how much you cared. He saw needs and found ways to meet them, simple as that. Coralie's thoughts were interrupted when Everett entered the room, his presence a welcome sight. He carried a folder and raised it slightly in greeting. "Thought you might want some backup," he said with a grin. "I'm glad you're here," Coralie replied, her tension easing slightly. Everett joined her as Lydia handed Coralie a sealed envelope. "Walter left this for you," Lydia said, her tone reverent. Coralie opened the envelope carefully, revealing a handwritten letter and a detailed proposal. The letter began simply, "Coralie, I've watched you in the ER, your heart, your resilience. You remind me of the person I tried to be. That's why I trust you with this." The attached proposal outlined Walter's vision for a healthcare initiative aimed at providing access to underserved populations in Asheville. Mobile clinics, telehealth options, and partnerships with local organizations. It was ambitious, but feasible. However, Walter's time had run out before he could see it through. "You're the only one who can make this happen," the letter concluded. Coralie's hands trembled slightly as she absorbed the magnitude of what Walter had entrusted to her. "This is overwhelming," she admitted. "You don't have to do it alone," Everett said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out together," Lydia chimed in. Walter's work was never meant to end with him. It's meant to inspire others to continue it. Coralie nodded, her resolve strengthening despite the weight of her doubts. But a new problem loomed. Miles. She knew he wouldn't support this initiative, especially if it required reallocating hospital resources. As if on cue, Everett leaned closer and spoke in a hushed tone. "I overheard something before coming here. Miles has been talking to the board about you. He's painting you as unprofessional, someone who's too emotional to follow protocol." Coralie's stomach sank. "Of course he is," she muttered. "You'll need to tread carefully," Everett warned. "But if anyone can pull this off, it's you." Before they could continue, Lydia pointed to the back of the envelope Coralie still held. "There's something else," she said. Coralie flipped the envelope over and found a smaller folded note tucked inside. It was written in the same shaky handwriting as before. "There's a major donation waiting at First National Bank. The funds are tied to specific conditions. It's crucial you meet with the executor. Time is of the essence." Her pulse quickened. A donation of that scale could change everything. But what were the conditions? And why did it feel like Walter had anticipated every step of her journey? Coralie held the note tightly as she sat at her kitchen table, the early morning light streaming through the frosted window. The words, "Only those who dare to lead shall uncover its true value," seemed to echo in her mind. She had spent half the night turning the phrase over, trying to decipher its deeper meaning. What had Walter meant by dare to lead? Was this his way of testing her resolve? A sharp knock at the door startled her, pulling her from her thoughts. Everett stood on her porch, his breath visible in the crisp air. "I figured you could use some backup for this meeting," he said, holding up a steaming thermos. "Backup and coffee," Coralie replied with a faint smile. She stepped aside to let him in, grateful for his unwavering support. The two made their way to the law office where Walter's executor had arranged to meet them. The office was a quiet, stately place, with dark wooden furniture and walls lined with leather-bound books. Coralie felt a pang of anxiety as they were ushered into a conference room, its polished table reflecting the weight of the discussion to come. Mr. Porter, a gray-haired man with a calm demeanor, greeted them. After the usual pleasantries, he slid a folder across the table toward Coralie. "Walter Hughes was a man of foresight," Porter began. "He wanted his legacy to be more than a donation. It's a challenge, Miss Montgomery. He believed that true change requires courage and commitment." Coralie opened the folder to find a detailed document outlining Walter's vision for a healthcare initiative, much like the one he had shared in his letter. At the end was a clause that made her stomach drop. The funds, a substantial endowment, would only be released if the hospital leadership approved a public proposal to adopt and implement Walter's vision. Everett let out a low whistle. "That's ambitious." Coralie's mind raced. Securing approval from the leadership meant facing Miles head-on. As if reading her thoughts, Mr. Porter added, "I understand this places you in a difficult position, Miss Montgomery. But Walter believed in you. He told me as much." Coralie nodded, though the weight of the responsibility pressed heavily on her chest. Back at the hospital, the atmosphere felt colder than the winter air outside. Coralie caught Miles glaring at her from across the nurse's station, his expression a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Word had clearly spread that she had been in contact with Walter's estate. Later that afternoon, Miles approached her, his tone deceptively casual. "I hear you've been meeting with lawyers about some grand ideas." Coralie held her ground. "Walter left a significant endowment for the hospital. I thought you'd be interested in hearing about it." Miles's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Endowment or not, you're stepping out of bounds, Coralie. You're a nurse, not an administrator. Stick to what you're good at." The words stung, but Coralie refused to back down. Walter's vision wasn't just about money. It was about making a difference. "That's what this hospital is supposed to do, isn't it?" Miles leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Careful, Montgomery. Ambition has a way of backfiring." By the end of her shift, Coralie was exhausted, but Everett was waiting for her in the staff lounge. "I found something," he said, his voice low. He handed her a folder filled with old documents. "It looks like Walter made earlier donations to the hospital, but some of the funds were misappropriated." Coralie's heart sank. "Misappropriated? By who?" Everett shrugged. "The records don't name anyone directly, but Miles was in charge of overseeing allocations at the time. It's something to consider if he tries to block you." Coralie's phone buzzed just as she was processing the information. The message was anonymous. "Stay out of this, or you'll regret it. You've been warned." Her blood ran cold. She looked at Everett, her resolve hardening. "They can try to scare me, but this isn't just about me, it's about what's right." Everett gave her a reassuring nod. "And you're not in this alone." Despite his words, Coralie couldn't shake the feeling that the stakes had just been raised, and the dangers were only beginning to surface. Coralie paced back and forth in the quiet community center before the meeting began. The weight of the anonymous warning from the previous night still lingered in her thoughts, but Everett's steady support had been her anchor. The man's calm words echoed in her mind. "You're doing the right thing. Don't let them scare you off." She clung to that assurance now as the first attendees began to trickle in. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly, the buzz of conversations weaving through the room. Local families, retired workers, and small business owners gathered, their collective presence breathing life into the modest space. A large banner reading "Honoring Walter's Vision" hung above the podium, flanked by photographs of Walter Hughes in his younger years, always smiling, always surrounded by the people he had helped. Coralie smoothed her skirt and approached the podium, her nerves hidden beneath a determined smile. "Thank you all for coming today," she began, her voice firm but warm. "We're here to celebrate Walter Hughes, not just the man but the ideals he stood for: compassion, connection, and action." The stories flowed like a river, each one adding depth to the portrait of Walter's legacy. A middle-aged man shared how Walter had funded his child's surgery when insurance had failed them. An elderly woman tearfully described how Walter had anonymously covered her mortgage after her husband's passing. Each tale strengthened Coralie's resolve, threading together a tapestry of hope and gratitude. Toward the back of the room, a woman with a notepad and camera caught Coralie's eye. During a break, the journalist introduced herself as Amelia Bright. "I've been following the whispers about this initiative," Amelia said, her tone crisp yet curious. "If you're willing, I'd like to write a piece highlighting your efforts. The community deserves to know about this." Coralie hesitated, weighing the potential fallout. She finally nodded. "People need to see what's possible when we work together." Later, during the meeting's second half, Everett presented the details of Walter's planned initiative. The proposal outlined mobile healthcare units, partnerships with local clinics, and expanded resources for underserved populations. The room buzzed with excitement until Coralie's phone vibrated with a message from the hospital's administration office. She glanced at the screen, her stomach sinking. The email from Miles was terse and formal. "Miss Montgomery, your recent activities are unprofessional and jeopardize the hospital's reputation. Cease all unauthorized actions immediately, or further steps will be taken." Everett noticed her expression and leaned over. "Let me guess. Miles?" Coralie exhaled, shaking her head. "He's trying to intimidate me, again." "Let him try," Everett replied. "You've got an entire room of people who believe in this. Let's focus on them." His words steadied her, but the tension remained. By the end of the meeting, a plan was in place. Amelia would write her article, and the community would rally support ahead of the upcoming town hall, where Coralie planned to formally present Walter's vision. As the crowd dispersed, Amelia lingered by the door. She beckoned Coralie and Everett aside, her expression serious. "I've been digging into the hospital's financial records for another story," she said, lowering her voice. "I found something you should know about." Coralie frowned. "What kind of something?" "There's evidence suggesting that past donations from Walter were misused. It's tied to your administrator, Miles. If this goes public, it could blow up in a lot of ways, for better or worse." Coralie's breath hitched. The implications were staggering. If true, it could vindicate Walter's mission, but also risk destabilizing the hospital she cared deeply about. "What should we do?" Everett asked, his voice cautious. Coralie's gaze drifted to the photograph of Walter on the banner behind them. The man who had risked so much to uplift others wouldn't have hesitated to fight for the truth. But this wasn't just her battle. Every decision now felt like a double-edged sword. She squared her shoulders, meeting Everett's and Amelia's eyes. "We'll think carefully, but no matter what, we stay true to Walter's vision." Yet deep down, she knew the choice ahead wasn't so simple. The stakes had just grown higher, and the path forward was fraught with peril. Coralie sat at her small kitchen table, staring at the ominous email from the hospital board. The words blurred as her mind raced. Miles's influence was growing, his reach extending beyond the hospital walls. The community's hope, her determination, and Walter's legacy felt fragile under the weight of bureaucracy and manipulation. Everett's voice cut through her thoughts, steady and reassuring. "Coralie, you can't fight this alone," he said, sitting across from her. His eyes carried a mix of concern and conviction. "Miles knows how to play dirty, but you have something he doesn't: truth and the people on your side." She nodded, though doubt lingered in her chest. "The board meeting tomorrow. It feels like a final judgment. If they side with him, everything we've worked for could unravel." The next morning, Coralie arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, her nerves masked by a professional composure she'd honed over years. As she passed through the bustling corridors, whispers followed her like shadows. Staff who had once greeted her warmly now offered only curt nods or avoided her gaze altogether. It was clear. Miles's smear campaign was taking its toll. Later in the staff lounge, Everett handed her a printed flyer, a damning piece of propaganda Miles had circulated to the board. It accused her of jeopardizing hospital operations, exploiting Walter's legacy for personal gain, and fostering distrust among staff. "This is ruthless, even for Miles," Everett muttered, shaking his head. Coralie clenched the flyer, her voice shaking. "He's painting me as a villain to cover his tracks. But what if he's right? What if my fight is doing more harm than good?" Everett placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Coralie, listen to me. This isn't about you. It's about what Walter stood for, and the people who need this initiative. You're not alone in this." By mid-afternoon, Coralie was summoned to a private meeting with the hospital board. She entered the conference room with a calm exterior, but her pulse quickened at the sight of Miles seated confidently at the far end of the table. His smirk sent a clear message. He believed he'd already won. As the meeting began, Miles presented his case with polished eloquence. He painted Coralie's actions as reckless, claiming they had already tarnished the hospital's reputation. His words were met with a mix of nods and skeptical glances from the board members. When it was Coralie's turn to speak, she stood tall, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I understand the concerns raised here today," she began, "but I believe we have an opportunity, an obligation, to honor Walter Hughes's vision and the countless lives he's touched. This initiative isn't about me. It's about extending the compassion that Walter exemplified to those who need it most." Her words resonated with some of the board members, but the tension in the room was palpable. Just as she finished, the doors swung open, and Everett stepped in, accompanied by an older man wearing a weathered overcoat and a determined expression. The room fell silent. "Who is this?" Miles demanded, his irritation barely concealed. The man stepped forward. "My name is Daniel Westbrook. Walter Hughes was my mentor, and I'm here to support Coralie." Gasps rippled through the room as Daniel placed a thick envelope on the table. "This contains evidence of Walter's endowment conditions and additional financial support that I'm providing. I've stayed quiet until now, but it's time to set the record straight." After the meeting, Coralie and Everett met Daniel in the hospital's courtyard. The man explained his connection to Walter, detailing how the philanthropist had guided him through difficult times, and inspired him to pay it forward. "You're doing something important," Daniel said, his voice low but firm. "But the real fight begins now. Miles won't back down without a fight." That evening, as Coralie prepared for the upcoming town hall meeting, an email notification appeared on her phone. The subject line read, "Next steps, town hall presentation required." The board's decision was clear. Coralie's initiative would be publicly debated before any final approval. She sank into her chair, the weight of the next phase pressing down on her. The stakes had never been higher, and the path ahead was fraught with uncertainty. But deep within, a flicker of resolve remained, bolstered by Everett's loyalty and Daniel's unexpected support. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. The community center was electric with anticipation. Rows of folding chairs stretched to the back of the room, every seat filled, with many standing along the walls. The hum of hushed conversations grew louder as people jostled for better views of the makeshift stage, where a podium and projector screen stood waiting. Coralie stood just behind the curtain, gripping her notes tightly. Her palms were damp, and her heart raced as she peeked out, catching glimpses of familiar faces. Patients she had treated, neighbors from her small community, and even a few colleagues from the hospital. "Deep breaths," Everett murmured beside her, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his calm presence a balm to her fraying nerves. "You've got this." Coralie nodded, swallowing hard. "I have to, not just for me, for them." The room fell silent as the moderator stepped onto the stage. "Thank you all for coming," she began, her voice amplified by a microphone. "Tonight, we'll hear presentations regarding a proposed initiative that could greatly impact our community's healthcare. Let's welcome Coralie Anderson to the stage." A polite round of applause filled the room as Coralie stepped forward. The bright stage lights made it difficult to see past the first row, but she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. Clearing her throat, she adjusted the microphone. "Good evening," she began, her voice trembling slightly before steadying. "I stand before you today not as someone with a grand title or a position of power, but as a nurse, someone who has witnessed firsthand the struggles our community faces when it comes to healthcare." She clicked the first slide on the projector, displaying a photograph of Walter Hughes. Many of you knew Walter Hughes, a man whose generosity and vision touched countless lives. He believed in the power of community, in the idea that together we could bridge gaps and create access for those who need it most. Coralie spoke with a mix of passion and vulnerability, weaving together statistics about healthcare disparities with personal anecdotes. She recounted the story of a young boy whose life was saved by Walter's funding of an outreach clinic and shared testimonials from community members who had written letters of support. The audience leaned in, captivated by her sincerity. She felt the momentum building, her confidence growing with every word. This isn't just about continuing Walter's legacy. It's about building a future where no one has to choose between paying for groceries and getting medical care. Then came the interruption. Miles, seated in the front row, stood and raised his hand, his expression a calculated mix of feigned politeness and condescension. "Miss Anderson," he began, his voice smooth but sharp, "while your dedication is admirable, one must ask, are you qualified to spearhead such an ambitious initiative? And can we trust that your priorities align with the hospital's mission?" A murmur rippled through the audience. Coralie felt the sting of his words but stood her ground. "Mr. Miles," she replied evenly, "this isn't about me. It's about what's right for this community. And if qualifications mean caring deeply and being willing to fight for those who can't fight for themselves, then yes, I'm qualified." Applause erupted from the back of the room, drowning out Miles's attempt to respond. Encouraged by the show of support, community members began standing one by one to share their stories. A mother tearfully recounted how Walter's contributions had covered her child's surgery. A retired factory worker described how Walter had quietly paid off his medical debts. The tide was turning. Coralie could see it in the faces of the audience, in the way people leaned toward her with hope and determination. Just as the atmosphere reached a crescendo, the moderator announced a final surprise. "Before we conclude, we have something special to share," a message recorded by Walter Hughes himself shortly before his passing. The room fell silent as the screen flickered to life. Walter's kind eyes and gentle smile filled the frame. His voice, though frail, carried a steady resolve. "If you're watching this, it means someone has stepped forward to carry on the work I started. To that person, I want to say thank you for your courage, your compassion, and your vision. The road ahead won't be easy, but know that you have my full support." Tears welled in Coralie's eyes as the video ended. The audience erupted in applause, many wiping their own tears. Even some of the board members exchanged thoughtful glances, their skepticism visibly softened. As the meeting concluded, the moderator approached the microphone. "The hospital board will deliberate on this matter and provide a decision within 2 weeks. Thank you for your passion and input tonight." Coralie stepped off the stage to a wave of handshakes and words of encouragement, but the uncertainty gnawed at her. 2 weeks felt like an eternity, and she knew Miles wouldn't spend that time idly. The fight was far from over. The waiting was unbearable. Coralie sat in the break room, staring blankly at the clock as its second hand ticked with agonizing slowness. 2 weeks, 2 impossibly long weeks, stood between her and the board's decision. Her mind raced with doubts, replaying every moment of the town hall meeting. Had she said enough? Had she been convincing? Everett entered, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. "Still waiting on news, huh?" he asked, offering her a sympathetic smile. She nodded, grateful for his steady presence. "It feels like the walls are closing in," she confessed, her voice trembling. "Miles is doing everything he can to make me look like the villain." Everett sat across from her, leaning in. "Coralie, you've already done something extraordinary. You've given people hope. That's no small thing." His words were comforting, but they didn't silence the storm brewing inside her. The hospital hallways had become a gauntlet of whispers and side-eyes, with colleagues avoiding her gaze or offering tight-lipped smiles. The weight of their judgment pressed heavily on her chest. Later that afternoon, Coralie found herself in the staff lounge, sifting through the latest round of administrative memos. Among them was a thin, nondescript envelope. She hesitated before opening it, her heart sinking as she read the contents. An official warning from Miles accusing her of disruptive behavior and compromising hospital operations. The document felt like a slap across the face. Her phone buzzed. A text from Everett read, "Meet me in records. Found something you'll want to see." Coralie made her way to the basement archives, where Everett was waiting with a file folder in hand. "I dug into Walter's previous donations," he began, his voice low. "And look at this." He spread out a series of documents on the table, pointing to line items and transactions that didn't add up. "These are records of how Walter's donations were allocated," Everett explained. "But look here. Funds earmarked for community outreach clinics were redirected to administrative budgets, under Miles's approval." Coralie's stomach churned. "He's been using Walter's generosity to pad the hospital's bottom line," she whispered, anger flickering in her chest. Everett nodded. "And if we can prove it, we might have a way to stop him." That evening, Coralie returned home, emotionally drained. She pulled Walter's bridge pin from her purse, tracing its intricate design with her thumb. The pin had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder of the connections she was fighting to preserve. But tonight, it felt heavier than ever. Was she truly strong enough to carry Walter's vision forward? The next morning, an envelope with no return address was waiting for her in her mailbox. Inside was a stack of photocopied documents, each one more damning than the last. Transactions, emails, and signed authorizations, all pointing directly to Miles's financial misconduct. At the bottom of the pile was a single handwritten note. "Use them wisely, or lose everything." Coralie stared at the documents, her hands trembling. The implications were enormous. She had the power to expose Miles, but at what cost? If she acted recklessly, she could jeopardize not only her career, but the entire initiative she had fought so hard to build. That evening, Coralie sat alone at her kitchen table, the documents spread out before her like pieces of a puzzle. Her mind raced as she weighed her options. The stakes had never been higher, and the choices she made in the coming days would determine not only her fate, but the future of Walter's legacy. As she stared at the bridge pin resting beside the papers, a new determination sparked within her. Whatever came next, she would face it head-on. But the next knock on her door brought a new wave of uncertainty. Opening it cautiously, she found an unfamiliar face, a courier holding a sealed envelope. "For you," he said simply before walking away. Inside was a single piece of paper with 3 words scrawled in bold ink. "You've been warned." Coralie's hands trembled as she clutched the anonymous message from the night before. "You've been warned." The weight of the words hung in her mind, gnawing at her confidence. The evidence against Miles felt both like a weapon and a liability. One misstep, and everything she'd worked for could crumble. Seeking solace, she hurried to Everett's office, her heart pounding with the urgency of the situation. "Everett," she said breathlessly, shutting the door behind her. "We need to talk." He looked up from his desk, concern etched into his face. "What happened?" Coralie laid the stack of incriminating documents before him, explaining the anonymous note and her fears of escalating the situation. Everett frowned as he sifted through the papers. "This is damning," he muttered. "But if we're not careful, it could backfire." "How?" Coralie pressed, her frustration bubbling over. "This is proof of everything Miles has been doing. Why shouldn't we bring it to the board right now?" Everett leaned back, choosing his words carefully. "Because people like Miles know how to spin things. If he gets ahead of this, he'll frame you as the problem, not the solution. We need to be strategic." Coralie nodded, though doubt lingered in her eyes. "So what do we do?" "We bide our time," Everett said firmly. "Let the evidence speak for itself when the stakes are highest. And whatever happens, don't let him see you coming." The private meeting with the hospital board was set for the following afternoon. As Coralie entered the conference room, she felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Miles was already there, seated with an air of smug confidence. The board members exchanged polite nods as she took her seat. "Miss Whitman," one of the board members began, "we understand you have information regarding Mr. Hughes's recent donations." Coralie stood, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within. "Yes, I do. Walter Hughes entrusted this hospital with resources meant to serve the community. However, evidence suggests that some of those funds were misappropriated under Mr. Miles's oversight." A ripple of murmurs spread across the room. Miles's expression darkened, but he quickly composed himself, flashing a tight-lipped smile. "These are serious accusations, Miss Whitman," he said smoothly. "But as always, context matters." He gestured to a file in front of him, which his assistant promptly distributed to the board. Coralie's heart sank as she scanned the contents. The documents were fabrications, meticulously crafted to paint her as an opportunist, exploiting Walter's legacy for personal gain. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to maintain her composure. "This is preposterous," she countered, her voice sharp. "You're twisting the narrative to deflect from your own actions." Miles leaned back, feigning disappointment. "The board will decide what's preposterous. My only concern is the stability of this institution, something that's been jeopardized by these baseless accusations." Before Coralie could respond, a voice interrupted from across the room. It was Dr. Layton, a senior administrator and someone Coralie had trusted implicitly. "I hate to say this," Layton began, avoiding her gaze, "but Miles raises a valid point. We can't afford to risk the hospital's reputation over unverified claims." Coralie stared at him in disbelief. "You've been working alongside me this entire time. How can you—" "Because he's been working with me," Miles interjected, his tone laced with triumph. "Dr. Layton understands the bigger picture, something you seem to have lost sight of." The betrayal hit Coralie like a physical blow. She turned to Layton, her voice breaking. "You knew what this meant to me, to the community." Layton shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. The damage was done. That evening, Coralie sat alone in her small apartment, her thoughts a tangled web of frustration and despair. The betrayal had shaken her deeply, leaving her questioning everyone around her. Could she trust anyone? Could she even trust herself? A soft ping from her phone broke the silence. It was an email from the anonymous donor. The subject line read, "Prepare for what's next." Curious and cautious, Coralie opened the message. The email was brief but cryptic. "Your mission is bigger than this hospital. Get ready for the deliberation. Everything changes then." The words lingered in her mind, sparking a flicker of hope amid the darkness. Whatever lay ahead, Coralie knew she couldn't afford to falter. She would find the strength to fight back, even if it meant standing alone. Coralie stood in the middle of the community center, the weight of her mission heavier than ever. The message from the anonymous donor lingered in her thoughts. "Your mission is bigger than this hospital." She glanced around the room, its walls adorned with pictures of past events Walter had spearheaded, food drives, health fairs, and scholarship ceremonies. This place wasn't just a building, it was a beacon of hope. Taking a deep breath, she addressed the small group that had gathered to discuss the future. These were the people who believed in her vision, the same vision that Walter had entrusted her to carry forward. Everett stood by her side, his unwavering support bolstering her confidence. "I won't lie to you," Coralie began, her voice firm yet tinged with vulnerability. "This fight has been harder than I ever imagined. But Walter's legacy isn't just a memory, it's alive in each of you. And together we can make sure his vision for a better future doesn't fade away." Her words sparked murmurs of agreement. An older woman named Maeve raised her hand. "Walter saved my grandson's life," she said, her voice breaking. "When no one else would help, he stepped in. If you're fighting for what he stood for, you have my full support." Others began sharing their own stories. A young man detailed how Walter's scholarships had enabled him to attend college. A mother spoke of how Walter had funded the medication her daughter needed to survive. Each testimonial added another layer to the weight of Walter's impact and Coralie's responsibility. As the meeting progressed, a journalist from the local paper who had been following Coralie's journey stood up. "I've been digging into some of the claims surrounding Miles," she announced, her tone resolute. "What I've found is deeply concerning. Mismanagement of funds, questionable allocation of resources. This hospital deserves better." Gasps filled the room. Coralie's heart pounded. "You're publishing this?" she asked cautiously. The journalist nodded. "It's already being printed. The board will have to take action." Coralie's stomach churned. She knew the expose would add pressure on the board, but it also risked dragging the hospital's reputation into the mud, a risk she wasn't sure she was ready to take. Everett leaned in, sensing her hesitation. "This could be the turning point," he said quietly. "The board won't be able to ignore it." With the rally set for the next evening, Coralie threw herself into preparation. She and her team contacted community members, gathered testimonials, and created flyers urging attendance. By the time the sun set, the community center buzzed with activity. People from all walks of life had come together, united by a shared belief in Walter's vision. The rally began with a montage of photos and videos showcasing Walter's legacy. Tears filled Coralie's eyes as she watched faces light up in recognition of the man who had touched so many lives. When it was her turn to speak, she felt the weight of every story, every hope resting on her shoulders. "Walter believed in bridges," Coralie said, holding up the pin she now wore on her lapel. "Not just the physical ones, but the bridges we build between each other, between those who need help and those who can give it. Tonight I'm asking you to be that bridge." The room erupted in applause. Coralie glanced at Everett, who gave her an encouraging nod. The journalist was in the back, scribbling notes, and even Maeve, who rarely left her home, sat proudly in the front row. As the rally wound down, Coralie felt a sense of hope she hadn't experienced in weeks. But just as she was beginning to relax, her phone buzzed. It was an email from the hospital board. "Due to recent developments, we will be delaying our final deliberation. A new date will be announced shortly." Her heart sank. The delay felt like another tactic from Miles to buy himself time, to manipulate the situation further. The faces of those who had placed their trust in her flashed through her mind. She couldn't let them down, not now, not ever. As the crowd dispersed, Everett approached her. "This isn't over," he said, his voice steady. "If anything, this is just the beginning." Coralie nodded, gripping the bridge pin tightly in her hand. "We keep fighting," she said, determination burning in her eyes. "No matter what." The air in the hospital conference room was thick with tension as Coralie sat at the long table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The emergency board meeting had been called with only a day's notice, and she had spent every moment since preparing. The stakes had never been higher. This was her last chance to ensure Walter's vision lived on, and to expose Miles for the harm he'd done to the institution they both claimed to serve. Across from her sat Miles, his usual smug expression now tinged with a hint of unease. Despite the journalist's expose and mounting evidence against him, he had managed to maintain his position. For now. His ability to twist narratives and plant doubts had proven dangerous, and Coralie knew he wouldn't go down without a fight. The room fell silent as the board chair, a stern-faced woman named Eleanor, began the meeting. "We're here to address two critical matters: the approval of Miss Laurent's initiative and the allegations of financial misconduct against Administrator Miles." Her voice was steady but carried an edge of exhaustion. "Miss Laurent, you may begin." Coralie rose, her legs trembling slightly as she faced the board. She took a deep breath and scanned the room, her gaze settling on Everett, who nodded encouragingly from the gallery. She steadied herself, channeling the strength of the community members who had shared their stories at the rally. "Thank you, Chairwoman Eleanor," Coralie began. "I stand here today not for myself, but for the countless lives touched by Walter Hughes. His vision wasn't just about healthcare. It was about dignity, compassion, and building bridges where none existed." She paused, holding up the bridge pin Walter had left behind. "This pin symbolizes the connections we can create, the lives we can change. The initiative I'm proposing is not about adding another program to the hospital's roster. It's about fulfilling a promise to those who have been overlooked and underserved." Coralie's voice grew stronger as she shared testimonials from the rally and statistics supporting her proposal. She painted a vivid picture of what the program could achieve, from mobile clinics to subsidized treatments for vulnerable populations. She finished with a plea. "This isn't just a program, it's a chance to redefine what our hospital stands for, and I'm asking you to be the leaders who make it happen." Miles was quick to respond, his tone dripping with condescension. "Miss Laurent is an idealist, and while her intentions are noble, they're impractical," he said, rising from his chair. "This hospital operates on limited resources, and diverting funds to her initiative would jeopardize our ability to serve the broader community." He paused, then added with a smirk, "And let's not forget that Miss Laurent has leveraged public sentiment to pressure this board, a tactic that undermines the professionalism and integrity of our institution." Murmurs rippled through the room. Coralie's chest tightened, but she refused to back down. Before she could respond, Eleanor intervened. "Mr. Miles, we're here to discuss the facts, not character judgments. Please continue with your defense." Miles's smirk faltered, but he launched into a lengthy explanation, deflecting blame and downplaying the evidence against him. It wasn't until Everett stood up, armed with detailed records, that the tide began to turn. "Members of the board," Everett said, addressing the room with calm authority, "the evidence speaks for itself. Mr. Hughes's previous donations were mismanaged under Mr. Miles's oversight, funds redirected to projects that bore no resemblance to their intended purpose. And now we have an opportunity to correct that." He handed a packet of documents to Eleanor, who flipped through them with a furrowed brow. "Miss Laurent's initiative isn't just feasible, it's necessary. The community stands behind her, and so should this board." Coralie felt a surge of gratitude for Everett's unwavering support. She watched as the board members exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from skepticism to contemplation. The deliberation was brief but excruciating. When Eleanor finally spoke, her words sent a wave of relief through Coralie's body. "The board has voted unanimously to approve Miss Laurent's initiative and to initiate a formal investigation into the allegations against Mr. Miles." Applause erupted from the gallery. Miles's face turned pale as he tried to protest, but his voice was drowned out. Security personnel approached to escort him from the room, his parting words a bitter hiss. "This isn't over, Laurent. You'll see." Coralie sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by a mix of triumph and exhaustion. The journey had been grueling, and she knew it wasn't truly over. But for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel hope. As the room emptied, Everett approached her with a smile. "You did it, Coralie." "No," she said, shaking her head. "We did it." He handed her an envelope, his expression curious. "This came for you. Another letter from Walter's executor." Coralie opened it cautiously, her heart racing as she read the contents. The letter revealed an undisclosed condition in Walter's will. The initiative's long-term funding was contingent upon reaching specific milestones within the next 3 years. Her victory suddenly felt more fragile, the weight of the responsibility settling heavily on her shoulders. She folded the letter and looked at Everett. "The fight isn't over," she said quietly. "It's just beginning." The room was packed with reporters, community leaders, hospital staff, and curious onlookers. Cameras flashed as the board chair, Eleanor, stepped up to the podium. Her expression was a blend of calm authority and weariness from the past week's tumultuous events. Coralie stood to the side, her heart pounding as she prepared to hear the official announcement of her initiative's fate. Eleanor adjusted the microphone, her voice steady as she began. "Thank you all for being here. Today, the Asheville General Hospital Board of Directors is taking significant steps toward rebuilding trust and reaffirming our commitment to the community we serve." A hushed silence fell over the crowd. Coralie's hands tightened into fists at her sides, bracing herself for the outcome. "After a thorough investigation into financial misconduct," Eleanor continued, "we have determined that Administrator Miles violated ethical and fiduciary responsibilities. Effective immediately, he has been removed from his position, and we will be implementing new accountability measures to prevent similar issues in the future." There was a collective murmur from the crowd, followed by the rapid clicking of reporters' cameras. Coralie exhaled deeply, relief washing over her as Miles, seated in the back of the room, rose and stormed out without a word. His parting glare shot in Coralie's direction, but she stood firm, refusing to let his bitterness dampen the moment. Eleanor raised her hand, silencing the whispers. "Now, regarding the proposal put forth by Miss Coralie Laurent, the board has unanimously voted to approve the initiative. This program will prioritize healthcare access for underserved populations, align with Mr. Walter Hughes's vision, and redefine the role of our hospital in this community." Applause erupted, and Coralie felt tears prick her eyes. She turned toward Everett, who grinned and gave her a thumbs up from his seat among the staff. Around the room, community members beamed with pride, their voices joining the celebration. As the applause subsided, Eleanor gestured toward Coralie. "Miss Laurent, we thank you for your dedication and leadership. This initiative represents more than a program. It's a promise to the people of Asheville." Coralie stepped forward to a round of applause, the bridge pin pinned prominently to her blouse. She spoke with gratitude and determination, sharing the impact of Walter's legacy and the importance of the community support. "This isn't just my victory," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "It's ours." After the press conference, Coralie mingled with hospital staff and community leaders. One elderly woman, clutching a framed photo of her late husband, approached with tears in her eyes. "Miss Laurent, you don't know me, but Walter helped my family when we had nothing. You're continuing his legacy, and for that, I'll be forever grateful." The words bolstered Coralie's resolve, but her moment of triumph was soon tempered by an unexpected announcement. Walter's executor, a reserved man named Mr. Stanton, approached with a small leather-bound notebook in hand. "Miss Laurent, may I have a word?" Curious, Coralie stepped aside with him. Stanton opened the notebook to a specific page, his voice low as he explained. Walter's vision didn't stop here in Asheville. He established endowments in multiple cities across the country, all with the goal of creating a network of community-driven healthcare initiatives. He believed you could be the one to lead this effort. Coralie's heart raced as she scanned the page. The entries detailed plans for similar programs in Chicago, Denver, and beyond. Stanton continued, "The board here will oversee Asheville, but Walter's will specifies that someone must spearhead the national effort, or the funds will revert to a general trust." The magnitude of Walter's vision left Coralie reeling. She glanced around the bustling room, the faces of the community she had come to love etched with pride and gratitude. Could she really leave this place and take on a mission of such scale? The weight of the decision settled on her shoulders, her mind a whirlwind of questions and doubts. As if sensing her hesitation, Stanton added, "You don't have to decide immediately, but the clock is ticking. Walter believed in you, Miss Laurent. It's why he left this task in your hands." Later that evening, Coralie sat in her small apartment, the bridge pin resting in her palm. It had become a symbol of everything she had fought for, of the connections she had built and the legacy she had vowed to protect. The thought of leaving Asheville felt like abandoning a part of herself, yet the opportunity to expand Walter's vision was a call she couldn't ignore. Her phone buzzed, breaking her reverie. It was a message from Everett. "Whatever you decide, you won't be alone. We're with you, every step of the way." Coralie smiled, the message offering a moment of clarity amidst her inner turmoil. She took a deep breath and glanced back at Walter's notebook, the pages filled with possibilities and challenges. The decision would define not only her future but the future of countless communities across the country. For now, though, all she could do was prepare for what lay ahead. The road wasn't just difficult, it was daunting. But Coralie knew she had come too far to turn back. The sunlight filtered through the hospital's east windows, casting long shadows across the bustling halls. Coralie stood in the atrium, watching volunteers in bright blue vests hand out brochures for the newly launched initiative. Each step they took, each smile they gave, felt like a small yet profound ripple in the vast pond Walter had left behind. Her thoughts wandered as she reviewed the latest patient success stories. There was Mrs. Hayes, a retired schoolteacher who had gone years without proper health care, now receiving regular treatments thanks to the program. Then there was young Jamal, a boy with asthma whose mother tearfully thanked Coralie during last week's clinic opening. Each story added weight to the program's importance and its future. In the community center that evening, Coralie sat among volunteers who shared their motivations for joining. One man, an ex-carpenter named Sam, spoke about how Walter had quietly paid his medical bills during a rough patch. "I always wanted to give back," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And now, thanks to you, I can." Her heart swelled at the support, but the growing impact of the initiative also brought new challenges. Skeptics within the hospital's leadership questioned the program's scalability. "A noble effort," one board member had said dismissively, "but the logistics of expanding nationally are daunting." Coralie knew they weren't entirely wrong. Leading this effort was like navigating uncharted waters, and now the tide was pulling her toward something far greater. Everett had been a constant anchor through it all. His calm demeanor balanced her moments of uncertainty, and his leadership within the hospital bolstered the initiative's credibility. That evening, as they reviewed schedules for the week's free clinics, Everett looked up and grinned. "You've built something extraordinary here, Coralie." "I didn't do it alone," she replied, though a flicker of doubt passed through her mind. Could she entrust Everett with Asheville's program while she pursued Walter's national vision? She leaned back in her chair, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on her chest. Everett must have sensed her hesitation. "You don't have to decide everything right now," he said gently. "But whatever you choose, know that you've already made a difference, here and beyond." Later that week, Walter's executor, Mr. Stanton, summoned Coralie to his office. The room was lined with bookshelves, and a single lamp illuminated the polished oak desk where a slim envelope awaited. Stanton gestured for her to sit as he pushed the envelope toward her. "These are the final instructions Walter left," he explained. "His vision wasn't just for Asheville, it was for communities nationwide. This outlines the resources available for a national rollout, but it's up to you whether to lead it." Coralie's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope, revealing meticulously handwritten notes from Walter. The details were staggering. Funding sources, partner organizations, even draft plans for clinics in underserved urban areas. Walter had anticipated obstacles, but believed deeply in the power of connection. "Trust the bridges you've built," one note read. "They will carry you further than you ever thought possible." That evening, Coralie found herself walking across Asheville's iconic bridge. The cool night air brushed against her skin as she paused midway, gazing at the city below. The bridge had always been a symbol of connection for her, between past and present, between her and the people she served. It reminded her of the countless hands that had reached out in support and the miles she had yet to cross. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Everett. "You've got this. We'll hold things down here." She smiled, her resolve strengthening. But the decision wasn't just about logistics. It was about leaving a community that had become her home. Could she walk away from the people who had trusted her to lead? Or was stepping forward the ultimate way to honor Walter's legacy? Back at her apartment, Coralie found one last letter waiting for her. The familiar handwriting brought a lump to her throat as she opened it carefully. The letter was dated weeks before Walter's passing. "Coralie," it began. "Leadership isn't about knowing all the answers. It's about taking the first step and trusting the bridge you've built. You are ready, even if you don't feel it. Trust yourself, trust the people who believe in you, and step forward with courage." The words struck a chord deep within her, dissolving some of the doubts that had weighed her down. She set the letter aside, gazing at the bridge pin on her desk. Walter's legacy was more than a program or a series of clinics. It was a call to action, a challenge to make the world a little better, one connection at a time. Coralie exhaled deeply, knowing the choice she had to make. The road ahead would be uncertain, but Walter had been right. The bridges she had built would carry her further than she had ever imagined. The soft hush of snowfall blanketed Asheville, painting the town in a serene white glow. From her apartment window, Coralie watched as the morning unfolded, the snowflakes catching in the pale sunlight. It was a scene eerily similar to the winter evening when her journey with Walter's vision began. Yet today, something felt different. A quiet resolve had settled within her. Coralie sat at her kitchen table, the bridge pin resting in her palm. Its polished surface reflected the morning light, a tangible reminder of everything she had learned and achieved. She had spent the night revisiting Walter's notes, each line imbued with his unwavering belief in kindness and connection. His final letter, urging her to trust the bridges she had built, lingered in her thoughts. A knock at the door broke her reverie. It was Everett, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. He stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. His smile warmed despite the chill outside. "Big day," he said, setting a cup in front of her. "How are you feeling?" Coralie took a sip of the coffee, letting its warmth seep through her. "Nervous," she admitted, "but ready. I think I've made my decision." Everett nodded, his calm presence steadying her. "You've always been ready, Coralie. Asheville is proud of you, and so am I." Later that morning, Coralie stood before a small crowd at the community center, her heart beating steadily as she prepared to speak. Community members, hospital staff, and volunteers gathered in support, their faces a mosaic of hope and gratitude. The success of the Asheville program was evident in the stories they shared: lives saved, families supported, and opportunities restored. Walter's dream had already sparked something extraordinary here. Coralie cleared her throat, her voice steady but laced with emotion. This initiative started with one man's vision, but it has grown into something much larger. Because of all of you. Your stories, your support, and your belief in this program have turned an idea into a reality. And now it's time to take the next step. She paused, letting her words sink in. "I've decided to accept the offer to lead the national expansion of Walter's vision. This wasn't an easy choice, but I believe we can make an even greater impact by connecting communities across the country, and I promise Asheville will always be the heart of this initiative." The room erupted in applause, tears glistening in the eyes of many. Everett stepped forward, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll keep the foundation strong here," he said. "You've built something that will last." That evening, Coralie walked the familiar path to Asheville's iconic bridge. Snow crunched softly beneath her boots as she reached the center, pausing to take in the view. The river below mirrored the soft glow of the streetlights, and the city stretched out before her, a community transformed by compassion. She pulled the bridge pin from her pocket, its weight both grounding and symbolic. This small token, once a curious mystery, had come to represent everything Walter had stood for: connection, resilience, and hope. She thought of Walter's final words: "Trust the bridge you've built." A deep breath filled her lungs as she gazed into the distance, imagining the new bridges she would build in cities yet to come. The journey ahead would be challenging, but she felt ready, because she wasn't walking it alone. The connections she had forged in Asheville, the people who had rallied behind her, and the lessons Walter had imparted would guide her every step. As she turned to leave the bridge, her phone buzzed. A message from Everett lit up the screen. "The team is ready to start tomorrow. Let's make Walter proud." Coralie smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. She tucked the pin back into her pocket and started toward home, the snow falling softly around her. Walter's legacy wasn't just about healthcare or programs, it was about people. It was about kindness and the profound impact of a single compassionate act. And as Coralie took her first step toward the future, she knew that legacy would live on, not just in Asheville, but in every community where a bridge was built to connect those in need. As Coralie's journey comes to a close, her story reminds us of the profound impact a single act of kindness can have, not just on one life, but on an entire community. Walter's legacy wasn't just about financial contributions. It was about compassion, vision, and the courage to build bridges where none existed. Through her struggles and triumphs, Coralie showed us that true leadership lies in connection, empathy, and the belief that change is always possible, even in the face of doubt and resistance. This story invites us to reflect on our own lives. What small acts of kindness can we offer to those around us? How can we contribute to building stronger, more compassionate communities? The answers may seem simple, but as Coralie and Walter demonstrated, the ripple effects can be extraordinary. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What moments in this story resonated most with you? Have you experienced a time when kindness or courage transformed your life or someone else's? Let us know in the comments below. Your voice can inspire others. And if this story moved you, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Here at Soul Threads Chronicles, we share powerful stories of hope, resilience, and the human spirit. Don't miss our next story. It might just change how you see the world. Thank you for being part of this journey. Until next time, let's continue building bridges of kindness together.